Here to dive into industry trends with leading ETF experts, this is ETF Spotlight with Nina Mishra.
Hello and welcome to ETF Spotlight. I'm your host Nina Mishra. My guest today is Zacks Senior Stock Strategist Kevin Cook, and we are talking about semiconductor stocks and ETFs, which is one of our favorite topics. And we know that chips are the basic building blocks of computation, so they have become integral in everything from smartphones to cars, laptops, PCs, video gaming, data centers, and the pandemic had supercharged the demand for computing. So that's why chip stocks had outstanding performance in 2020 and 2021. They have taken a beating this year. The broader chip index is down about 27% year to date. So we are going to talk about what's going on with these chip stocks, and Kevin will share his favorite semiconductor stock picks, and then I'll talk about the popular ETFs in this space that investors could use if they want a diversified exposure to the industry. Kevin, welcome back. Great to have you on the show.
Hey, thanks, Nina. This is going to be an exciting conversation because, as you said, chips have taken a beating this year. But just even in the month of April, I mean, we had that bounce off the March lows, and then I'm just looking at the SOX index, rallied back, sort of a relief rally up to 3,600, and now is trading 2,900 today. I mean, if you didn't know better, you would say that the chip stocks are forecasting a recession because they are just being sold wholesale, right?
Right. Yeah, this is a very interesting area. And we will talk about whether this is a great buying opportunity for investors or investors should stay away. So last year, annual sales for the chip industry, semiconductor industry, they topped $500 billion. And that was for the first time. And I read a report by McKinsey. They expect chip industry to be a $1 trillion industry by the end of the decade. So we know that demand environment remains very, very strong, but we have seen these continued supply-related disruptions, and the war has just made the situation worse because Russia and Ukraine, they are major exporters of palladium and neon, which are used to make semiconductors. And then we have seen renewed lockdowns in China because of their zero COVID policy, so that has also worsened supply chain disruptions. So I would love to hear your thoughts on demand supply situation to start with.
Yeah, so I'm not a traditional semiconductor analyst, so I don't follow the ebbs and flows of, say, Intel's business necessarily, but I tend to focus on the companies that are sort of at the bleeding edge, and Nvidia would be one of those, which because they're so heavily involved in artificial intelligence and advanced technologies like machine learning, and their sales are projected to grow 28% this year to $34.5 billion. Now, the stock is always traded at a premium because basically Nvidia is so good at what they do in providing the tools to other companies for machine learning, for robotics, for advanced high-performance computing solutions and AI, that Nvidia basically invents new industries because they allow corporations to do new things with their data and their factories. And so for that reason, Nvidia trades at a premium. It's consistently traded near 20 times sales, which is pretty expensive. But the market supported that for the longest time, and now it's just running away from that. So Nvidia broke major support at $220. Is trading like 185 today, and now is nearing, based on next year's projected sales of $40 billion. the stock is trading in the low teens on a price to sales multiple. And so I think it's a bargain here just because Nvidia is creating the future, but investors don't seem to agree right now. As I said earlier, it seems like they're forecasting a recession, and I just don't see it in the data. Just because interest rates are ticking up and will go up, pretty significantly this year, and their global growth is slowing a little bit. I still think that we're in the middle of what I call a technology super cycle, and that was a phrase I coined in 2017 to describe why was inflation so low in 2017 and productivity appeared to be hidden. And it's basically technology innovation that just makes corporations and individuals more efficient with all kinds of new tools. So, and I just see that continuing, and the investment. You talked earlier about the forecast for semiconductor sales to cross $1 trillion. That doesn't surprise me at all because of the investment in mobile applications, new automations in factories and robotics, artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles. These investments, I think, will continue to grow because that's the leverage that corporations have on the future.
Right. And the McKinsey report that I mentioned that says about 70% of growth is predicted to be driven by just 3 industries: automotive, computation, and data storage and wireless. And these industries are not going to slow down at all. In fact, the world's largest contract chip maker, Taiwan Semiconductor, which makes almost all of the world's most sophisticated chips. When they reported their results earlier this month, they said that the capacity remains very tight throughout 2022. And we know that the US now just accounts for less than 15% of global chip production, and EU less than 10%. In the 1990s, US had accounted for almost 40%, and EU had accounted for a little more than 20%. And we know that the governments are now trying to expand the domestic chip making abilities, particularly in the wake of these massive supply chain disruptions that we have seen, and shortages and renewed geopolitical tensions too, because then governments realize that the world is so much dependent on Taiwan and Taiwan Semiconductor for chip supplies. But chips are not easy to manufacture. The manufacturing process is very complex, and we will talk a little bit more about that when we discuss one of your topics, ASML. But foundries cannot be expected to fix this near-term chip shortage. So demand remains very, very robust, and supply shortages are expected to continue for some time. So when I hear about chip industry entering, a cyclical downturn, it surprises me a little bit. I know the industry has been prone to these boom bust cycles in the past because sometimes customers overorder and then they pause buying if the demand goes down due to economic slowdown, leading to an oversupply of chips. And the global economy is expected to slow down this year because inflation is rising and central banks are tightening the monetary policies. So what are your thoughts on a cyclical downturn in chips?
Yeah, so one thing I want to go back to that you mentioned was the data center and why that continues to grow. That is a key component of this, that because data is the new gold, right? In an information economy, corporations realize that their leverage on the future is in their ability to gather, organize, and manipulate data. And so that's totally machine learning is the tool for that. So the data centers need these high performance chips from Nvidia and AMD. And one of the most interesting stories I love to tell people is that, listen, this all came from video games, right? So if you think about it, how did Nvidia and AMD become what they are for HPC, high performance computing, and the data center and AI. It's because they built their expertise in the video cards, the GPU chips for gaming. And that expertise and experimentation with massively parallel architectures is what allowed Jensen Huang at Nvidia and Lisa Su at AMD to realize, oh my gosh, we have the architecture for AI in the data center. So that's an exciting story that I think most people don't know. And the reason I've been such a bull on these companies is because their revenues went from 60-70% gaming cards to now shifting to the majority being to the data center. But to your more recent question on the possibility of a cyclical downturn, I was going to ask you about, we've already been in the chip shortage, right, before the war in Ukraine. And then we learned that so many of these minerals and rare earth materials that are essential for semiconductor manufacture come from that area. So how big a factor is that, do you think, in compounding the chip shortage and then adding to costs that are going to impact the bottom line for these companies?
So I have been bullish on semiconductor stocks and ETFs for a long time, and I remain bullish because I see that demand continues to surge. Chips are used in everything, and particularly there would be a lot of demand for high performance chips, the kind that you mentioned, Nvidia and AMD produce. And these supply chain disruptions are going to continue, and foundries are not going to be built overnight. These would require years to build and start producing those kind of chips. So I definitely do not see a cyclical downturn in the industry anytime soon, but I may be wrong. So we will see. So now let's talk a little bit more about Nvidia. And I know that you have owned this stock for a long time. You have been bullish on Nvidia for many years. And this is a company which manufactures chips which power cutting edge computing in, data centers, gaming, cryptocurrency mining, autonomous vehicles. It is the biggest and best supplier of parallel computing chips. And when they reported their results, latest results earlier this year, they now see a total addressable market of $1 trillion for its chips and related software. The stock
that was one trillion with a T, right?
Yes, 1 trillion. Yes, and Nvidia stock is down a lot this year, but it was one of the best performing S&P 500 index stock. Last year, it was up more than 125% in 2021. So talk a little bit more about Nvidia and which areas that Nvidia supplies chips to do you see best growth for the stock?
Well, as I just talked about before, the data center is becoming the large growth driver, just because, when you think about the cost of these machines that Nvidia can build, and Nvidia's architecture can be scaled, so you can you or I can buy a $5,000 to $10,000 advanced GPU card if we want to do cryptocurrency mining in our basement. But this building block can then be stacked in the hundreds to create a supercomputer. And that's basically what happens. Nvidia has a box called a DGX for $68,000, you can have your own supercomputer. And then corporations are able to stack these in sort of a module way and create, you go from, I call them massively parallel architectures, because that's sort of the terminology for having thousands of GPU processing cores. Well, when you suddenly create millions of them, then you can do these massive computations that scientific institutions like to do, or corporations. And these are the people who can afford that kind of number crunching, data work horsepower. I wrote a piece for Zacks Confidential subscribers back in March called AI Frontiers, what we learned from Nvidia GTC. And GTC, as you know, is their semi-annual GPU tech conference, which is just always an amazing event because Jensen Huang and his team of fantastic engineers, they will wait until a GTC to roll out. It's almost like the magic shop opens the doors. And so, for instance, at the last one in March 21st through the 24th, they issued no less than 14 press releases that day for individual significant innovations. And so I just made a whole list of them, and then I profiled 5 of them in my report. I'll read you a summary of some of the headlines here of what I thought stood out about what NVIDIA unveiled. So let's see, Jensen and company, wow, the crowd. Okay. NVIDIA AI delivers major advances in speech, recommender system, and hyperscale inference. So here was my take. These advancements are important because inference is a faster type of learning for neural networks, as opposed to traditional machine learning where a network is trained specifically on millions of samples of the actual data it will be called to distinguish, like images, words, an anatomy and physiology, consumer shopping behaviors. Inference with deep learning takes place when the network creates new knowledge from patterns of trial and error. So this is how AI teaches itself in deep learning. NVIDIA unveiled a new CPU superchip. So while Intel has been the dominant player in the CPU, and NVIDIA is focused on the GPU with thousands of parallel processors, NVIDIA realizes, hey, we need to be in CPUs too for the data center and integrate those with the GPUs. So their new CPU set is called Grace, and then they also have a Hopper chip. And Grace Hopper was a woman scientist, computer scientist. I believe she was, I can't remember if she was in the Army or the Navy, but it's just so cool that they created this tribute to this military woman computer scientist who most of us have never even heard of. Another innovation was NVIDIA launches AI computing platform for medical devices. And this is a huge area. AI is so critical for medical imaging. And we'll talk later when we get to quantum computing about fMRI and PET scans. But what NVIDIA is able to do in terms of using advanced computing to image for disease and health is just amazing. Another thing I love about NVIDIA, they keep pushing the envelope with their robotics kit. So basically, Jensen AGX is a system of hardware and software that a corporation can buy, and then they can custom build their own robotics platform for, like BMW has done it to build cars and reinvented their factory floor. And that's the other thing to remember about NVIDIA is you're not just talking about hardware. You're talking about a full hardware software stack. They call it CUDA, which stands for Compute Unified Device Architecture. And so that becomes a framework and a massive set of tools for developers and engineers to build whatever they need. And there's another element. I mentioned developers. NVIDIA knows how to evangelize to the people actually doing the building and the coding. So software engineers, hardware engineers, coders, NVIDIA puts the tools in their hands, and those are the people who are going to build it, for any corporation on the planet. And I just want to look at my fifth note. Oh, the Omniverse. Listen, long before Mark Zuckerberg conceived of the metaverse, Jensen was envisioning the Omniverse, which is, and what they announced in March was Omniverse Cloud will connect tens of millions of designers and creators, being able to work on projects together simultaneously. So These are just some of the examples of the innovation coming out of NVIDIA that continue to push the envelope. And if you want to stay tuned to this, you don't have to wait for the next GTC conference which will be like in October. Just go to the NVIDIA newsroom, Google NVIDIA newsroom, and make a habit of going there once a week or at least once a month, and you will just see a list of new innovations that are just constantly coming out in autonomous vehicles, in the Omniverse, for instance, too.
Right. I totally agree with you. NVIDIA's GTC is such an amazing event to watch. They have so many, amazing things. And I also wanted to talk about Omniverse that you mentioned. I think the race for the metaverse is going to heat up in the coming years. The metaverse may be a few years away, but the race will be heating up and we will see billions of dollars of investment in this area. And NVIDIA's Omniverse is already way ahead in that race. And, companies like BMW, you talked about BMW using NVIDIA software. So they are using NVIDIA's platform to create these digital twins of their physical factories and cars. That is such an interesting area because cars in those digital factories are assembled by simulated robots, and which kind of revolutionizes the planning processes and maximizes efficiency. So that is an very interesting area with a lot of growth potential.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up because I saw Jensen speak last year at an online event, and this is so meta because he gives tools to BMW so they can simulate what they want their next factory or car to look like and how it's going to operate. And the reason it's meta is because Jensen says, this is how we build our chips. We simulate everything first before we send the order instructions to the foundry to build it. So they can simulate and test everything, because it's vital because we're talking about going into the sub 10 nanometer sphere, right? And, for those of you who can't remember what a nanometer is, it's a billionth of a meter. And you can think of the coronavirus as about 50 nanometers big. And these architectures are being built at 7 nanometers and 5 nanometers, just microscopically small to just pack more transistor power into the smallest space possible with the highest speed and the lowest resistance.
So Jensen Huang is such a great innovator and he's a visionary. And I think that is one big reason to own NVIDIA stock, because we will continue to see great things coming out from that company because of having such a visionary founder and CEO. And another great visionary and innovator in the chip industry is Lisa Su. Lisa Su took over AMD in 2014. At that time, the company was on the brink of bankruptcy, and she totally turned the company around. The stock is up more than 2,000% since then. And another thing common between Jensen and Lisa is that both of them have Taiwanese origin. So that's an interesting fact.
That's apparently where the brains come from.
Yeah. And so let's talk about AMD, because I know that you like that stock also a lot. Do you own it in one of your portfolios? Okay.
And so I've talked a lot about NVIDIA, and you listening to me, you would almost think, NVIDIA is this category of one that makes them better, faster, and smarter than Intel, Qualcomm, or anybody else, or Texas Instruments. And that's relatively true, except that AMD is almost as good as NVIDIA. What Lisa Su has done is amazing, and they really do the same things. And in terms of the GPU platforms, and AMD is innovating just as much. They've got, Lisa Su has really just, the talent that these people have. Like, I put them in the category of an Elon Musk. These people surround themselves with the top engineering talent in the world. So, it's not just that Elon is so smart or Jensen's so smart or Lisa's so smart, which they are, but they also know how to hire the smartest people in the world to do their engineering and development. So what's interesting about AMD is that it gives corporations an alternative that I call dissimilar redundancy. And dissimilar redundancy is the idea that instead of just relying on one GPU chip, maybe we could buy both NVIDIA's, for this data center, and maybe we'll buy AMD's for this data center over here. And that way, we're not at risk of having a failure related to a particular manufacturer. So that's dissimilar redundancy. And a lot of corporations do that. They'll buy both. And the other thing to really love about AMD is it always trades at less than half of the valuation of NVIDIA. NVIDIA is the premium valuation at, currently, let's say it's, 12, 13 times sales. AMD is trading at 5 times sales. And and to me, and the sales growth is just as strong there. Let me take a look at the sales growth here you're looking at 30% sales growth this year for AMD to cross 21.5 billion, and projected to see 24 billion next year, and very profitable, just like Nvidia. So I think you have to own one of them. So take your pick, really.
Right, and the stock is down more than 40% year to date. So a great opportunity for long-term focused investors, a great company with a great CEO, a visionary CEO. Now, Nvidia is the hottest chip stocks. All the chip investors know about Nvidia. AMD is also very hot, very popular among US investors. The third pick of yours, ASML. This company, I think many investors do not know about this company, though this is one of the most important companies in the chip industry. This is a Dutch manufacturer of extreme ultraviolet lithography, or EUV. These machines, they use light to print patterns on silicon wafer at minuscule scale. And these machines are critical to production of, most advanced microchips, which are used in 5G or computers for AI, smartphones, data center. ASML, they sell these machines to leading chip manufacturers, including Taiwan Semi, which is the world's most advanced chip manufacturer, Intel, and Samsung as well. So talk to us about ASML and why you like that stock.
Yeah, I mean, they're essential, right? So you mentioned the laser lithography. This is etching, right? If we're going to go below sub 10 nanometers, it obviously requires the precision of laser light etching. And that's what ASML does. So they have the big customers, the foundries you mentioned, Taiwan Semi and Samsung, and they're just indispensable to going into this sub 10 nanometer sphere. The stock has also been really beaten down, and they have quite a pedigree for their technology too. They've been doing some deep R&D for decades. So they really know their stuff. And I think I've recommended the stock before when it's traded 700 and fallen back to support. I obviously think it's a better buy now here down in the 500s for the long term, because they're just so indispensable to the industry. And speaking of foundries, one thing we didn't touch on is with global supply chain issues, we have two trends going on in the U.S. here, where this new consortium foundry, what's it called, Global Foundries, is getting up and running. And then we had news in just the last few weeks that Nvidia said they would start using Intel to help them build chips instead of doing everything overseas. Mm-hmm. So there's flexibility within the semiconductor industry to adapt to the global supply chain issues.
Right. It remains to be seen whether Intel can modernize its processes to match those
That's
of
true.
Taiwan Semi, because Taiwan Semi is years ahead of Intel as of now. So Intel has some work for them to match those kind of capabilities. So switching gears a little bit, I also wanted to talk about quantum computing, which is another area you are very bullish on. Now, this technology is still in very early stages. So talk to us about this technology and its long-term growth potential, and which are the best stocks to benefit from this technology.
Yeah, I just watched a presentation this week from the guy who used to head up Google X's quantum computing area. His name is Jack Hittery, and he actually incubated a company within Google X, which is now actually called Alphabet X. But Google X, you think of it as it's the secret lab, right? It's the skunk works of Google, where all the secret stuff gets done out in the desert. And so he incubated this company called Sandbox AQ, and the AQ is for artificial intelligence and quantum computing combined. So he just branched off of Google X with Sandbox AQ, and the guy is just an amazing teacher about quantum computing, and he hangs out with Peter Diamandis and obviously the folks from Google, and this is such an exciting area. So I'm going to give you one focus to tell you actually how quickly this is coming. We're all familiar with traditional network security, which uses an RSA model, right? So there was the company RSA, but RSA was named after three guys, and that encryption model is still the basis of much of computer and network security. So what Jack Hittery thinks is that they're working on what they call QSE, quantum secure communications, and I mean the quantum world is funky to begin with. Even Einstein and Max Planck, they discovered this stuff in the early 20th century, and basically by the 1930s they had it all figured out. But even in 1905, Einstein was scratching his head about quantum mechanics. And I'm going to read this quote from him from a letter he wrote. This theory of quantum mechanics reminds me a little of the system of delusion of an exceedingly intelligent, paranoiac, concocted of incoherent elements of thought. Basically, you sounded like when you start talking about quantum mechanics, you sound like a crazy person. And that was sort of the crisis that the physicists were having a century ago, when they were going from the classical world to the quantum world, where a particle could also be a wave and be in two different places at once. But this is actually getting borne out. And the simple way I like to explain it, how quantum computing works and makes it have more power, orders of magnitude more power and speed than traditional computing is. Traditional computing is based on bits of, it's either a 0 or a 1, right? That records the information. Well, you can think of quantum computing, since an electron or a qubit is like the essential information component of a quantum computing system. Think of it as moving between 0 and 1. So it has the probability of being a wave or a particle, or being in two different places at once, or having different states. And so then it opens up this whole range, like we think of, between 0 and 1, the probability spectrum. So that's the degree of revolution that we're approaching. So what Hittery thinks with what's possible with quantum secure communications is that they will create quantum security for computers that will be unhackable. Because right now, the RSA model of encryption is still hackable. We hear about it all the time. But they've proven the Chinese have a satellite in orbit right now that has tested the ability to send single a single photon in two different directions and have it show up, and there's no way to hack that. It's almost mind-boggling to talk about it, and I'm not even explaining it well. But the experiments are in the works, and obviously, if Google has invested the time and money in this, there are big things happening. IBM is investing big money in quantum computing, and thinks it will. It is really the next revolution in computing. Hillary thinks that corporations must adopt some form of quantum secure communications in this decade by like 2030. Eight years from now, he thinks every corporation will have to have some aspect of quantum secure communications for advanced encryption that goes beyond the RSA model.
Excellent stuff, Kevin. I'm sure we'll have you back on the show sometime soon again to talk about chip stocks or artificial intelligence or quantum computing. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Nina.
So that was Kevin Cook, Zacks senior stock strategist. We talked about Nvidia, ticker symbol NVDA, AMD, ticker symbol is AMD, and ASML, ticker symbol is ASML. We also discussed Taiwan Semiconductor, ticker symbol is TSM there. Now, if you want diversified exposure to the space, you can take a look at one of the chip ETFs. The most popular ETF in the space is by Weneck, the Weneck Semiconductor Etf. The ticker symbol is SMH. This follows a market cap weighted index and is quite top heavy. Top 10 holdings account for about 59% of the portfolio, and these top holdings are Nvidia, Taiwan Semi, ASML, all stocks that we discussed today. The second most popular in this space is by I Shares. It is the I Shares Semiconductor Etf. The ticker symbol is SOXX. This follows a modified market cap weighting methodology, has 30 holdings, so little less top heavy than SMH, but still quite top heavy, with the top 10 holdings accounting for about 57% of the portfolio. Avago, Broadcom or Avago, ticker symbol AVGO, Nvidia and Intel are its top holdings. Now, if you are looking for more exposure to smaller mid-cap sized companies in the space, then you can look at the SPDR, Snp Semiconductor Etf, ticker symbol is XSD. This follows an equal weighted index, so that is why tilted towards smaller and mid-cap companies. This is also quite popular, and this charges 35 basis points in expense ratio. Now, last year, Invesco launched a semiconductor ETF, which tracks an index which is quite similar to the I Shares chip ETF. The Invesco product has a ticker symbol of SOXQ. This is a smaller ETF in the space currently, about 63 million in assets, but it is the cheapest with 19 basis points in expense ratio. And in full disclosure, I own SOXX and XSD in the ETF investor portfolio that I manage. Thanks for listening. If you like our show, please leave us a rating on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. And also make sure to subscribe to our podcast so that you do not miss any episode. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, please email podcast@zacks.com.
This material is being provided for informational purposes only, and nothing herein constitutes investment, legal, accounting, or tax advice, or a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold a security. Do not act or rely upon the information and advice given in this podcast without seeking the services of competent and professional legal, tax, or accounting counsel. Publication and distribution of this podcast is not intended to create, and the information contained herein does not constitute an attorney-client relationship. No recommendation or advice is being given as to whether any investment or strategy is suitable for a particular investor. It should not be assumed that any investments in securities, companies, sectors, or markets identified and described were or will be profitable. All information is current as of the date herein and is subject to change without notice. Any views or opinions expressed may not reflect those of Zacks Investment Research as a whole.